Hello, and welcome to Spotlight.
Ever since January 20th, 2025, when Donald Trump assumed office again as the 47th President of the United States, each alliance and their member states have been redesigning their trade and security policies with regard to the United States. In this episode of Spotlight, we have a conversation between Professor Baladas Ghoshal and senior journalist and author Apratim Mukarji, focusing in particular on Southeast Asian nations and their developing policy slants with regard to China and the United States.
Professor Ghoshal,
Yes.
please tell us, enlighten us about how the Southeast Asian nations are coping with the completely topsy-turvy world situation right now following President Donald Trump's tariffs and security policies, how they're coping with this situation now.
Southeast Asians, by and large, are very pragmatic in their orientation. They had been pursuing a policy which can be called a dual approach. On the one hand, they find it very beneficial to trade with China because China happens to be the largest trading partner of almost all the Southeast Asian countries. So, they consider trading with China the most beneficial aspect of the development aspirations. On the other hand, there are problems with China on the question of territorial issues, South China Sea. And sometimes related to that, there are problems with fishing, unannounced kind of fishing, all that creates a lot of uncertainties. And China has been very, very assertive in its claim on those territories, even to the extent of claiming some of the territorial waters, according to the international about 200 nautical miles from the shore happens to be the territorial waters of a particular country. Now, China's 9-dash line sometimes overlaps with this. So you have a situation whereby China is a very beneficial power in terms of the development aspirations as well as trading. On the other hand, you have security concerns. So what the Southeast Asian countries were doing till the time Trump came into power was that on security issues, they tried to develop closer understanding with the United States and some of the Western countries to hedge against China in case of any trouble that might occur from China's assertive behavior. On the other hand, on economic issues, in fact, some of the surveys that have come out in, one from Indonesia last year in September, and one that has already been taken this year, but it has not been released publicly. But some of its reports have come out. In fact, they find China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, is quite helpful for developmental needs of many of the Southeast Asian countries. In fact, the rate, BRI, even above Japan's, aid to some of these countries, and even United States. So you have a situation whereby, they were already adopting a policy, or they were trying to sort of navigate many of the problems that were emerging in this particular area. Now, Trump's tariff policy obviously poses a new problem because Trump has become very transactional. That mutual, what you call counter tariffs or whatever it's called, whichever amount of tariff that, countries sort of have vis-a-vis the US products, America will also, impose the similar percentage of tariffs. Now, this obviously disturbs the trade and investment and other economic activities. Now, not only actually disturbs the economic interactions between the United States and some of the countries, and also puts some difficulties in terms of its trade with China as well, because China is also facing the brunt of American tariff policy. Now, because of this, the Southeast Asian countries find it very difficult to navigate for the time being, because they think that, for them, trade and investment is the major source of their legitimacy in power. By providing economic benefits to the people, they can claim legitimacy from the people. Now, until and unless they can show to the people that economic development and rate of growth remains the same, they cannot claim the kind of legitimacy that other governments derive. Because we talk about democracy, we talk about constitution, but in Southeast Asia, they don't talk about this constitutional and other kinds of things, although they also abide by the constitution. But for them, economic empowerment is much more important than others. So now in this kind of a situation, whereby they find that, not only the economic areas are affected, but even the security issues. Because already the Americans, the United States has withdrawn quite a bit of its commitment towards Europe. And they have now also asked Japan and South Korea also to contribute for whatever security that they're deriving from American guarantee. Now, this kind of transactional things automatically puts a brake in terms of security understanding. And they're not also sure at this moment regarding Taiwan, because until Biden was in power, there was some kind of iron-tight kind of a commitment on the part of the democratic government to actually support Taiwan's, not independence, but the status quo. And they do not approve that China should use force to change that status quo. Now, from Trump's policy, it is now becoming apparent that he may not have this kind of commitments for too long. And even if he tries to maintain his commitments, he will ask for a price from these countries, not what the Democratic administration had given. For them, America's supremacy in this region need to be kept. And for that, we need the collaboration and cooperation from the Southeast Asian countries. And during Biden administration, they never asked for actually a kind of payback for many of those things. Now the Trump administration asking for those payback, that what can you offer us in terms of the kind of relationship that you want to maintain. Now that puts a lot of stress and uncertainties in regard to ASEAN's attempt to navigate the kind of geopolitical uncertainties. But then, they are very pragmatic in their orientation. So the trend that is emerging, that they're coming closer, much closer to China rather than the United States. In fact, some of the surveys that have been undertaken shows that China is becoming the most important power in the perception of Southeast Asian China is distrusted because of its, assertive behavior. Japan is the most trustworthy, followed by, some other countries. But Japan doesn't have that kind of resources to give the kind of guarantees that, they might require in terms of China's aggressivity and uncertainties that might come from Trump's transactional nature. So they're at a kind of an uncertain position, and still they have not been able to evolve a particular approach, definitive approach. What they're trying to do at the moment is to watch and see how things develop, whether the opposition to Trump emanates from within and brings about a major transformation. So for the time being, they're maintaining very close contact and close relationship with China, downplaying some of the tensions in security areas and trying to highlight the major economic benefits.
Would you say that all the Southeast Asian countries are together in evolving a new policy towards China and the United States? Are they together? To
I
the
think
same degree, to the same degree.
No. Some of the countries, for example, the Philippines, and even to a certain extent Vietnam and Indonesia, because Philippines has, security relationship with the United States. And United States also received a number of bases in the Philippines. And the Philippine bases are very important from the point of view of, America's strategic interest in the region, particularly for their, if at all they come, for the defense of Taiwan. Because from Philippines, Taiwan coast is the coast is not very far. And in case, Taiwan falls to the Chinese, it will pose a major threat to the American interest in the region, not only to the Philippines, but also to the American interest in the region. So with the result, Philippines itself is evolving a policy on their own, and particularly under the new president, Marcos Jr., who has been adopting a tough policy towards the Chinese on the question of territorial issues. And in fact, even preparing for its own defense requirements, strengthening its military capabilities. For example, as you know, 2 years back, India has agreed to offer the BrahMos missiles batteries to the Filipinos. And some of it has already been had been delivered to the Philippines. Indonesia is also planning to, acquire BrahMos missiles, but it may take a little time for the future sort of negotiations and how it can be worked out. Vietnam is also one of the major seekers of BrahMos missiles. So, the countries that consider their interests much more vital in South China Sea, because not all countries of Southeast Asia are actually claimants to South China Sea. They don't have dispute with China. Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, and Vietnam. These are the 5 countries which has territorial disputes. Now, these 5 countries actually have one set of policies towards the United States as well as to China. And the other remaining 5 or 6 countries, including, East Timor, they have another kind of policy towards China. Because whereas in the case of the claimant states, they try to evolve a kind of a joint approach towards, this particular territorial issue. Whereas the other countries in the region have differences. With the result, in none of the ASEAN meetings over the last 10 years have been able to bring out a joint statement. The last joint statement on South China Sea, which really sort of played an important role in restraining China, was in 2005. After that, they have not been able to come out with
It's
a
a long
joint
time.
statement.
Long time ago.
Yeah. And although they have been talking about a kind of a code of conduct, but the code of conduct has also not been established. In fact, China is dictating terms to them. And even if some kind of state uh, code of conduct is established, it will be at China's terms. And that would not be very pleasant to the Southeast Asian country. So you have some countries who are trying to strengthen their defense preparation vis-a-vis China. Not that they are able to really defend themselves against China, even if they prepare, but at least temporary sort of defense against China by securing arms and equipment either from Europe or from the United States, and now sometimes from India and also from Russia. Russia is an important partner also of Southeast Asian countries. And Russian influence in the region is also expanding now because Russia is a major seller of weapons and also energy. So, they are trying to adopt a kind of a policy whereby on security issues, again, the difference between some countries and some others. And that is why they have not been able to stand so much against China, because other countries have no interest in having a kind of a tough or aggressive policy towards China, because many of them are client states of China and benefit enormously through economic goals and other kinds of things, like Cambodia, Laos, to a certain extent Thailand also, and then Myanmar. They cannot do without China, particularly the military regime, cannot do without China's support. Already they are losing to the so-called, independent forces or the insurgent groups. But still, whatever, they're able to keep intact in their military position in certain areas, it is essentially because of the help that is coming from either Russia or from China, the weapons. India doesn't sell any weapons anymore to Myanmar. And India's influence is also now declining, particularly with the kind of civil war that has been going on in the country. And India itself is also not very sure which side to go at the moment, because things are very sort of, uncertain in that country.
You have described the Southeast Asian countries as practical minded. I am asking you this question in the context of recent reports about 2 days back that India is now re-evaluating its policies of sanctions and all that to China, which were imposed after the border clash between India and China in 2020. Now, in the light of this development, that India is evaluating its policies and thinking about reducing the sanctions and seeking to expand trade with China. Would you say that India is following the right path?
I think India is following the right path because, you have to, international relations and foreign policy approaches, are driven by the circumstances and the kind of benefits, the cost and the benefits that you derive from your interactions with the other powers. Now, so far, United States adopted a very tough attitude towards China on the question of many of these border issues or territorial waters, South China Sea, and the question of, the a kind of a rule-based order and other things. Some of the recent statements of Trump on China are very considerate towards China. The one doesn't know whether, Trump will drop many of his coalition partners or supporters in the like hot potatoes and might veer towards China and make a deal with China.
In fact, after he became president, he said he wanted to meet President Xi, and want to develop friendship with him.
He fluctuates, from one position to another position. One doesn't know what he will say tomorrow. He's already making a deal by trying to project a peacemaker on the Ukraine war and also on the question of Gaza. He's trying to derive his own the country, American benefits out of it. The kind of ceasefire arrangements that Trump has been talking about in Ukraine war, Russia-Ukraine war. He's giving Russia a lot of concessions. In fact, Russia has not agreed to surrender any of the territories that it has already occupied, particularly the areas where the Russians are, important sort of elements. Donbas area, Crimea also is another area. Now, because of the changes in the situation, Zelensky's position is also very weak. Zelensky might be himself might be a crook, and corruption and other things, charges are there against him. But at least his country is going to lose a big thing if Trump has his own way in dealing with Russia and getting a kind of a peace sort of proposal on the question of Ukraine. Because Russia has said no European powers, no security forces, so which means you put him almost into the mouth of the wolves, the Ukrainians. And he may be trying to seek a Nobel Prize by coming to present a proposal on this. My own understanding is that it will not succeed. Even if it succeeds temporarily, it will be another war sometime back, and Russia will move more and more into Ukraine. And who knows, Russia may have ambitions in other countries as well, nearby countries. So what Trump is doing is not a very trustworthy thing. And nobody can depend their strategy on sort of, trusts, rely on trust. So each country is trying to calibrate their policies towards US-China relationship and also US-Russian relationship. One of the objectives of Trump is also to, wean away Russia from China. So I think he's now trying only to take care of American interests, not the global interest as such. So in such a situation, I think every country will have to recalibrate their policies, and India is also doing the same thing vis-a-vis China.
Now, before we conclude, I am asking this question that some analysts believe that Trump's threats, they do not describe his policies as policies, but as threats, are very destabilizing. That is, deliberately he's seeking to destabilize the world, both economically and strategically. Now, would you say this description is quite correct?
In a way, it is. But at the same time, I think he's testing the waters.
Yes.
Many of his ideas was not there initially.
Yes.
Maybe at one point of time, he did think about all this, but he's testing multiple, waters and seeing how people react to the situation. He's a typical businessman.
He's,
He looks at the market.
in fact, these analysts say that his decisions are more political than economic.
It's very difficult to distinguish between politics and economy. Some people might call it political, but I think behind all that, he also has an economic sort of, goal. He wants to leave behind a legacy that he has been able to change the American politics as well as economy.
Yeah.
And been able to put America first, which no other governments had done.
Yeah.
So he's just testing waters.
Mhm.
Even the people whom he had taken, I don't think he takes all of them serious. He just presents them before the public to come out with ideas and sees how people reacting to them. I think he will change he will finally come to a certain policy framework, which could be at least understood clearly, not a kind of a vague, a kind of an uncertain sort of, an element. I think some kind of shape will come in another 3 or 4 months' time.
Now, after all, he has coined the phrase MAGA, Make America Great Again. So when he coined that phrase, he obviously had a goal in mind. And he's probably going to achieve it. But we'll have to let future decide how far he succeeds in his endeavor.
But he won't actually succeed in everything that he has been talking about.
Yeah.
He talks about taking over Greenland. He talks about, having, Canada as the 49th or whatever the last number.
51st.
51st state. And then he talks about Gaza being converted into a French Riviera.
Yeah.
Now, I think these are some of his wild ideas, but at the same time, behind these wild ideas, one can see a pattern that he wants to do something which others haven't done for the interest of the American public. And American public, has changed. I mean, I'm not talking about the intellectuals or the other sort of the so-called corporate sectors. I'm talking about the general American. I mean, the white Americans. And they want to see America change. And they don't like so many foreigners coming into the country, occupying important positions. And I think if you really put yourself in the same position, today everything is controlled by the so-called markets in the United States. So I think the American general people feel that at least, they should have a say in the working of the state. It may be very regressive kind of a attitude or temperament, but at the same time, that's the reality that is coming into the open. And it's not in America alone. It's happening in Europe. And you see everywhere there is a kind of a pushback against the kind of things that were happening over the last 4 or 5 decades in their countries. So I think the world is changing very fast. And one has to adjust oneself with this changing environment. The West concept about civilization, about state, about democracy, about economic interactions may not be acceptable to the rest of the world for a very long period. The West has dominated all these years. Now I think there'll be a different voice that will be emerging. And maybe it is the global South or even in Europe. I think already you see some changes that are on the way, in terms of defense, in terms of security, that, cutting down the dependence on the United States. And even in terms of human relations, I think things will change. So I think a lot of things are going to change, and one should be ready for those changes that are going to take place. And one has to also accommodate and adjust to the changing environment. But there'll be turmoil. It will not be an easy process.
So, Professor Ghoshal, thank you very much. We are concluding the interview right now. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.